Today I'm going to show you how I made this simple interaction in Unreal Engine 5 using dynamic materials, sequencer, and blueprints. So now we're in Unreal Engine 5. As you can see, it's a really basic model. It's all modeled in Cinema 4D and then exported out as a Cineware file format. You can then import that file using the Datasmith link. This lets you kind of iterate your scenes, and you can kind of just right-click, re-import if you ever feel like making changes. Next, I'll quickly show you my lighting setup. So I'll just scroll down here, turn these off. So my base light is just a skylight with an HDRI on it, and I've just bumped up the intensity. My interior lights is this left side foreground light and a right side foreground light, just to fill the scene a bit more and also create a few contact shadows. And then the last two smaller lights are for the foliage in the background. And then obviously the hero light in the scene is this window gobo light, which is really easy to set up. You just place a light outside wherever you want. And to make a gobo material, you just create a new material, make sure it's a light function in the material domain, drag in your gobo light, and then multiply it with a scalar parameter, which lets you control the intensity. And then you can use the quixel function to have a tiling function within your instance. So once you make an instance, now you have tiling, rotation, intensity, and within the light itself, you can adjust its color temperature or make it a custom color if you want. And to apply the material, you just scroll down, go to light function material, and drag it in. Super simple. Next, for the materials, also very basic. I just copied over the Quixel base material and made my own. And all that lets me do is just instance out a bunch of different materials that I can apply to all my objects. And then I've imported a few custom normal maps from concrete textures and towels and things like that, just because, as you can see here, different surfaces have different normals. So very simple, very easy to replicate. And then lastly is the foliage. So that was brought in through Quixel Bridge here. And this fern as well, and that was manually placed. And I painted these assets using the foliage mode here in the viewport. And that's pretty much it. Let's move on. So for the dynamic material setup, what we're essentially doing is animating between two colors using a linear interpolation, and we're just animating the scalar parameter plugged into the alpha. So what that means is if I go into my trolley material here, you'll see I have color 1 and color 2 plugged into a lerp, and I'm animating this alpha parameter. So what a lerp essentially does is, if I plug this in right here, when the alpha is at a value of 0, we'll be getting color 1, and when the alpha is at a value of 1, we'll be getting color 2. So you can imagine if we put this at 0.5, we are now halfway between color 1 and 2. So essentially what we're doing is we're just animating that value. And the way to easily animate this in Sequencer that I've found is using a material parameter collection. So that's this guy right here. So what that is it's just a bunch of those little scalar parameter nodes in one collection, hence the name. So you can see I have one for the sculpture, for the trolley, for the walls, and for the foliage. And all you got to do is just go into your content browser, right click, materials, material parameter collection. And once you've made that, you just go into your material of choice, right click, type in collection parameter. And now if you select the collection you just made, you can now choose from that list of parameters that you entered into the collection. So obviously for this one, I would choose trolley, which I have here. You plug it into the alpha, and what this lets you do is, if I go to my sequencer, you can now add that collection as a track and have access to all these values. And now you can keyframe these values in a sequencer track, which gives you so much control over timing, the stepping of every object. You can edit it in the curve graph editor, the easing in and out of things, and it just gives you a lot of control, which I really like. For the sculpture, it's a bit more complicated, but still quite simple. So if I go into the sculpture material up here, you'll know, if you remember from the start of the video, when I hover my mouse over the sculpture, you'll see this blue highlight gradient pop up. So that's essentially doing the same thing as I explained with the lerp. So all I have is this gradient setup right here. I won't go into too much detail, but there's a great video on this that I'll link below in the description. But I have these gradient parameters set up and the colors plugged into lerps, and which I end up animating later in blueprints. So if I go to my instance, material instance that I use on this object, you'll see these are the parameters that I made. And if I change this value to something like 40, you'll see this gives me control of where the gradient midpoint is. The power is like the harshness of the line. So if I make it like 20, you can see it becomes a lot more solid and less smooth. And the gradient scale is essentially just the scale of the gradient itself, like stretching it up and down. So if I go from 25 to 75, you can see it's a lot more gradual. But if I go down to like 5, it's very, very quick. So I found these values right here to be the best for my setup, and this would be at 70. So we'll be animating these later in blueprints, mainly because this is an interactive object and it's just much easier to do it in blueprints rather than keyframing everything and then playing those animations later on. And you'll notice, if I go back into it, in this first state, it is a green base color with a blue highlight. And then once I click it and the animation plays, it becomes a blue base color with a green highlight. So in the material itself, and then it switches back and forth. So in the material itself, this is where I've got the gradient switch, which we'll be animating in blueprints as well. And you'll see I have the green base, blue highlight, and then the blue base, green highlight. And then here is where I make the switch, which I'll go into more detail later in this video. Okay, so this is my really simple sequencer setup. Obviously I have my camera in here where I've animated it moving forward and back very slowly. If you keep an eye on this plant, you'll see that happening. Next, I have the gobo light where I've animated the rotation, the intensity, and the color temperature. So you'll notice in the green state, it's at a lower, warmer mode, and then in the blue state, it's at a taller rotation with a cooler temperature. After that, I've already gone through the material parameter collection keyframing, as you can see here. And then the rest is just transform keyframes. So just getting the object, rotating it, and then moving it back down and animating that. And to get a certain look for that animation, you can use the graph editor. And by default, your keyframes will be on auto. But if you select user in this menu, you will be given the handles, which kind of lets you play with the easing in and out of the animation itself. So that is my sequencer setup. So now we're at the juicy part of the tutorial, which is where all the interactions will be set up in blueprints, and I'll quickly show you what our end goal is. So we want to be able to go into the scene, hover over our object, have a blue gradient highlight come up, click our object, have the sequencer play that we set up earlier, and also have the material change to the blue base with the green highlight, and then click it again, and the sequencer then reverses back to its original state, and we want to be able to loop this or toggle it. First thing is first, go to your blueprints folder wherever you have it. We're going to make a game mode, so right click, blueprint class, game mode base, call it bp underscore game mode. I'll call it 2 because I already have one. And then we will want to go again, blueprint class, and now we're going to make a pawn. So BP underscore pawn, and I'll call mine pawn 2. Now open up your game mode. On the right here, all we need to do is change the default pawn class to BP pawn 2, which we just made. And next, to apply this to our game, go up to your project settings, and under maps and modes, in your default game mode, just choose the game mode that you just created. Now that we have our game mode and our pawn set up, let's jump into our level blueprint, and I'll just show you my setup. So first I have my enable input and show mouse cursor being triggered after the event begin play. And I also have enable mouse over events. So this lets you do the hover functions on our sculpture when the blue gradient pops up. Next, I have a set view target with blend. So this just makes sure I'm looking through this camera that I've chosen. All you got to do to set that up is have your camera selected, go back into your level blueprint, right click, create a reference, and then plug it into this view target blend node. And lastly, I just have these 4 or 5 nodes set up with console commands being executed. This just ensures that our foliage is at its highest quality and doesn't like fade off or go into higher LODs. And that's about it for our level blueprint. Now our next step is to convert our static mesh to an actor. Because this allows us to manipulate it in blueprints a lot more easily and have access to its materials. So mine's already a blueprint actor, but for example, say this is your static mesh and you want to convert it to an actor. Right click it, browse to asset, right click this, asset actions, create blueprint using this, save it wherever you want. You can call it BP target or something. Save, browse to that. Now to place it back in, you can do replace with, but I just like to drag it in and zero out the location in the XYZ. And then if you need to reapply materials, click the static mesh, drag in a material, and you are good to go. Alright, now we're gonna go into our BP pawn that we just created, and you should have this event begin play. And what we're gonna do first is create a reference to our sculpture and our sequencer so that we can use it and interact with it. So just drag off of your event begin play. I like to get a sequence. Off the first command, just get a get all actors, actually get actor of class. Find your sculpture, BP sculpture, return value, promote to variable, click this and call it sculpture. Compile, save. So now we have a reference to our sculpture in the variable list. Next, we go to drag off the second sequence, create level sequencer, select your sequence, out of the out actor, drag out, promote to variable, call this sequence underscore fade or whatever you named yours, save. Cool, now we have our variable set up. Now we'll go through making our mouse hover and unhover events. So just create a custom event, so add custom event, call it mouse hover, right click, add another custom event, call it mouse unhover. And what we want to do now is animate this this parameter gradient offset in our blueprint. So currently it's at 70, and then when I change it to 40, it is at a point that I think looks good. So we just want to animate it between 70 and 40. So to do this, grab the reference to your sculpture, drag out of it, get static mesh all the way down at the bottom because we want to access the static mesh material. Out of the static mesh, set scalar parameter value on materials. Parameter name is super important. We want to make sure it is the exact same as what we have labeled here. So mine is gradient space offset. So in here, I'll type gradient space offset. There we go. And when we hover on it, I want it to be 40. And then Control D to duplicate. When we unhover, I want it to go back to 70. So plug these in. Make sure this is all gone and plugged into. Hit play. You'll notice nothing happens because we have not told our game how to trigger the hover and unhover. We just made some custom events. So to do that, you want to go into your sculpture blueprint and we need to access these custom events that we made. So to do that, first we need access to our pawn. So out of event begin play, get actor of class, find your pawn that you made, drag out of return value, promote to variable, call this whatever you want. I'll call it BP pawn, compile save. Now drag out a get reference of your pawn and drag out of this. And now we can type in hover, mouse hover, drag out of it again, mouse unhover. Cool. And now we just need to click on our static mesh under our actor, scroll all the way down, on begin cursor over, and then click your mesh again, on end cursor over. So these are hover events built into our object. So on end cursor over, unhover, on begin cursor over, mouse hover, click compile, save, that's done. Now we'll click play and you'll notice our material is now changing when we hover on it. So that's great, but you can see clearly it's not animating because right now it's just switching between these two values instantly and not animating between them. So this is what we can do. Delete this second set scalar parameter value. Drag this out a bit. What we're going to make is a timeline. So add timeline. Call this gradient animation. And double click. And what this timeline lets us do is if you add a float track, we can now animate float values. And that 40 and 70 we plugged in earlier, they're just float values. So hold shift, click, create two keyframes, set the total length of this track to maybe 0.5 seconds. Select first keyframe time 0, second keyframe time 0.5. We'll give the second value a value of 40, and then the first keyframe can be a value of 70. Hit these two to zoom into your track. And now if you select both keyframes, right click, hit auto, you have a nice smooth easing in and out. Compile, save, go back to your event graph, mouse hover. So when we hover, we want to play this animation and update this parameter value. And when we unhover, all we need to do is reverse this animation. And last step is to plug in this track into our parameter value. So now that graph will go straight into our gradient offset. So compile, save, hit play. When we hover, you can now see our parameter value is animating. Okay, so now that we have the mouse hover event working, just to keep things organized, select everything, press C. We'll call this hover events. Just to group things. Select these, begin play events. And now we can get started. If I just line these up because I'm OCD, we can get started on the clicking animation. So when we click, we want it to trigger the sequence. So what we will do, right click, left mouse button, drag out of this. We'll grab a line trace by channel. And now we need to start an endpoint to shoot this line out of. So we'll get player controller, drag out of that, convert mouse location to world space because we'll be using our mouse for this. I'm going to set it up like this. So our start point will be where our mouse is, and our end point we'll need to give it a distance to shoot into. So we will multiply this. If we right click, convert pin, convert this to a float, we'll give this a value of 10,000. So it'll be 10,000 unit line shot from our mouse, which should be more than enough. And then because this is also a vector, we need to add these two values. So drag out of this plus, I'm gonna drop this pin to there. So we'll add the distance with the direction to make a vector and then drag that into our endpoint. Compile save. So now we have a line trace going out. Now how do we check the object that we're clicking on? We will drag out hit, break our hit result, twirl that down. First we need to make sure we actually hit an object. So to do that, we can drag out of our return value, type in branch, which is essentially an if statement. So now we have a branch, and I'll explain this in 1 second. How do we check that the actor we hit is our sculpture? Well, very simple. Drag out of our hit actor, type equals, equal. From this, you can either type in BP sculpt. You can do that, or what I like to do is just get our reference, drag it on top of this, and we'll check for this. Drag out of our Boolean return value, type out branch again, true, into that. So what this is essentially is we shoot out a line, we check if we've hit something, and if we have hit something, now we're gonna check, was our actor what we hit? And if it is our actor, do this stuff. And how do we test that? Just drag out of our true, type in print string. We'll call it hit, compile, save. So now, if I'm out here, I'm clicking, nothing's happening. If I go onto our actor and click, you can see we've hit our sculpture. So now we know that this works. Alright, so now that we know we can click our object, let's begin the sequencer setup. So first things first is we need to differentiate between when it's green and when it's blue. So to do that, we just create a new Boolean variable, type is green, question mark, compile save, drag that out, get the is green, drag out of that, get another branch, and put this true into here. So have we hit something? Yes. Is that something our sculpture? Yes. Do this. Now, let's set our default is green value to true because that is how we start our scene, is it starts on green. So if it is green, we want it to play our animation, and if it is not green, we want it to reverse our animation. Quite simple. So grab your reference of your sequence, type play sequence player. So is it green? True. Play the sequence, drag out again, type in reverse, play reverse. Is it false? Is it not green? Play reverse. Now we just got to make sure we drag out our Boolean again, but get a set and then leave it unchecked so it sets it to false. So once we play it, it now sets our Boolean to false, and then it'll reverse it. And then if you just click this Control D, set this to true, because once we've reversed it, it'll go back to green, and this effectively is a toggle. So compile, save, hit play, click, animation gets played, click again, animation gets reversed. So now we just need to do the material setup on our sculpture. So for the material animation on our sculpture, just grab the reference, get, drag out again, static mesh, scroll all the way down, get static mesh, just like before. And we want to set scalar parameter value on materials. And if you remember from before, if I go into my parent material, I had this parameter called grad switch, which swaps between the green state and the blue state. And we just need to animate this from 0 to 1 and then reverse it back from 1 to 0. So I'm just going to copy this name, Control C, go to parameter name, Control V, compile. And now we do the same thing as last time. Right click, add timeline, call this grad switch anim, double click, create a float track, length 2 seconds, shift click, 2 keyframes. First keyframe value 0 time 0, second keyframe value time 2 value 1. Hit these 2 buttons, select both keyframes, right click, auto, compile save, go back into your event graph. Let me clean this up a little bit. So when we play the sequence, we want it to play this timeline and update this value. And this will go from green to blue. And then when we reverse it, we plug this into reverse and make sure your floats are linked up. And this will go from blue to green. So let's compile, save, play. Cool, it works. So you can see it has a green highlight with the blue base and then the green base with the blue highlight. And now you can toggle between the 2 states every time you click. So one small thing that I want to just add in as like a final finishing touch, you can see if you spam click it, you can kind of go in between the animation states. I personally don't want that. So what we can do is right click, disable input, and then do a get player controller. Plug this into player controller. And when our animation, sorry, this one should be back here, before our is green. So once we click our object, we want to disable the input while the animation is playing. And then once the animation is finished, what we can do is just Control D, enable input, plug that into player controller, plug the finished into enable input. And now if we compile and play, I'll click once, nothing happens. Click again, nothing happens. So now we cannot spam click and bug out our animation. Hopefully that video was helpful and showed you some cool techniques that you can also apply into your scenes. Please let me know if you have any further questions or if things were unclear. And if you have any tips on blueprints, I know there are a lot of really good blueprint developers out there that maybe know more efficient ways to do this. So please let me know in the comments. Any constructive criticism is welcome. And I hope this was helpful. Peace.